Welcome to human and time. Settle into whatever place feels comfortable and allow the noise around you to grow a little more distant. If these quiet journeys through the past bring you peace, you can leave a like and subscribe to join us again. For now, there is nothing else you need to do. We are simply going to walk into another time. Long before Marcus Aurelius became an emperor, long before soldiers waited for his orders beside the cold waters of the Danube, there was a child in Rome named Marcus Annius Verus. He was born in the spring of the year 121. When Hadrian ruled an empire stretching from the misted frontiers of Britain to the warm provinces of North Africa, and from the Atlantic shores to the lands beyond Syria. But an empire of such size could feel very small to a child. For Marcus, the world began not with maps or armies, but with a household, familiar voices, the movement of servants through rooms, and the streets of Rome beyond the walls. His family belonged to the highest ranks of Roman society. Their roots reached back toward Baetica in Hispania. But by the time Marcus was born, they were firmly established among the senatorial aristocracy of the capital. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, possessed considerable wealth, including interests connected with the brick and tile industries around Rome. His grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus, had risen to the consulship more than once and occupied a respected place among Rome's governing elite. Yet the first great absence in Marcus's life came early. His father died when Marcus was still a very young child. There are moments in a human life that become important not because we remember them clearly, but because everything afterward grows around the space they leave behind. Marcus would be raised largely under the care of his mother and his paternal grandfather, surrounded as well by nurses, tutors, servants, and the complicated household world expected of a wealthy Roman family. Years later, when Marcus looked backward across his life, he did not begin by praising victories or offices. He remembered people. In the opening pages of the private writings we now call the Meditations, he quietly gathered the qualities he believed he had received from those around him. From his grandfather, good character and restraint. From the memory and reputation of his father, modesty and manliness. From his mother, piety, generosity, and a way of life far removed from unnecessary luxury. The emperor, looking backward, still saw the household in which the boy had learned how a person might live. Perhaps that is one of the gentlest truths hidden inside a life that would eventually become inseparable from imperial power. Before the purple robes, before petitions arrived from distant provinces, before military reports crossed his tables, Marcus's moral world was made from observation. A child watches. He notices how adults speak when they are tired. He notices who becomes angry and who does not. He learns whether wealth must always announce itself. He discovers that authority can be loud or quiet. Outside, Rome continued around him. Water moved through the city's aqueduct system and into fountains and basins. Feet passed over stone streets. Doors opened onto workshops and shops. Smoke rose from ovens. Carts and animals moved through a city whose rhythms changed between darkness and daylight. In wealthy houses, servants carried out the countless small tasks upon which comfort depended, while beyond those houses ordinary Romans occupied apartments, worked in shops, sold goods, carried water, prepared food, and began again the endless business of keeping a great city alive. Marcus belonged to the privileged world within that city, and nothing in his childhood should be confused with the experience of an ordinary Roman boy. His education alone made that clear. He learned both Greek and Latin within a culture that valued language as an instrument of power. For a young aristocrat expected to enter public life, words mattered. A speech in the Senate, a legal argument, a letter to an official, a carefully chosen phrase before an audience. These were not ornaments. They belonged to government itself. And so teachers entered his life. One of the earliest figures Marcus later remembered was Diognetus. From him, Marcus associated lessons against superstition and an attraction toward philosophy. The path was not yet the severe inward discipline that would define his later years. It was simply an opening. The suggestion that life might be examined, that inherited habits might be questioned, that the mind could be trained as deliberately as the body. Other teachers followed. Alexander of Cocium taught Greek language and encouraged a form of intellectual courtesy, the ability not to humiliate someone merely because they had used a word badly. Apollonius offered another kind of example, independence of judgment and steadiness under difficulty. Sextus showed Marcus a household governed without theatrical authority, combining seriousness with kindness. And then there was Junius Rusticus. Rusticus would become one of the decisive influences in Marcus's philosophical development. Marcus later thanked him for teaching him that his own character required correction and discipline. Through Rusticus, he encountered the teachings of Epictetus, the former slave whose Stoic philosophy insisted that freedom did not depend upon controlling the world outside oneself. The thought would follow Marcus for the rest of his life. There are things that come toward us without asking permission. Illness, weather, the judgment of another person, loss, political necessity, the behavior of strangers, the movement of time, and there are other things closer to the interior of the mind: judgment, intention, response. The distinction seems simple when placed into words. Living it is another matter. Marcus was still learning. Before the old emperor beside the Danube would remind himself to endure difficult people without hatred, there was a young man being corrected by teachers. Before he wrote privately about fame disappearing into time, he had been trained in the very arts that could make a Roman aristocrat famous. Before he warned himself about the corrupting influence of imperial life, he had grown up close enough to power to see how easily status could become a world of its own. Even Hadrian noticed him. The aging emperor developed an interest in the young Marcus and associated him with the name Verissimus, a play upon his family name Verus and the idea of truthfulness. While still a boy, Marcus entered institutions normally connected with Roman elite public life. He was enrolled unusually young in the equestrian order, and he became associated with the Salii, an ancient priestly college whose ceremonial traditions belonged to the oldest religious memory of Rome. So the child who was being taught philosophy was also learning ritual. Religion in Rome was not something separated neatly from politics, family, architecture, and public duty. Sacred responsibilities were woven into the civic world. Priests, temples, sacrifices, processions, calendars, vows, and ancestral customs formed part of the same landscape through which senators and magistrates moved. Marcus would eventually stand at the summit of that religious structure as Pontifex Maximus. But for now, he was learning its forms. One can imagine the contrast without inventing any private scene, the quiet concentration demanded by a tutor, and elsewhere the formal movements of Roman ceremony, Greek texts and Latin rhetoric, household courtyards and public obligations. The restrained example of his mother, and the immense theatrical presence of imperial Rome. These worlds did not remain separate inside him. They slowly became the material from which Marcus Aurelius would be made. Among his teachers, however, one relationship survives with unusual warmth because the voices themselves have not completely disappeared. Marcus Cornelius Fronto was one of the most celebrated Latin rhetoricians of his age. He was precisely the sort of teacher an ambitious Roman aristocratic family might value: a master of language, style, vocabulary, and public expression. Marcus became his pupil, and their surviving correspondence allows us to come closer to the young man than imperial statues ever can. Marble portraits tend toward stillness. Letters breathe. Within the correspondence between Marcus and Fronto there is affection, concern, instruction. Illness, family news, literary criticism, and the ordinary texture of two people maintaining a relationship across distance and responsibility. Fronto cared deeply about language. Marcus worked at rhetoric under him, searching for expression, reading, writing, and submitting himself to correction. There is something almost strange in knowing what awaited the pupil. The young man practicing Latin style would one day possess authority over much of the known Mediterranean world. Yet Fronto's task was not to teach him how to command armies. It was to teach him how to choose words. The lessons took place during years when Marcus's future was becoming increasingly unusual. Hadrian's succession arrangements changed everything. When Hadrian's intended heir, Lucius Aelius Caesar, died, the aging emperor needed another solution. In the year 138, Hadrian adopted Antoninus, the man history would remember as Antoninus Pius, but the arrangement extended beyond one generation. Antoninus was required to adopt both the young Marcus and Lucius, the son of the deceased Aurelius. Marcus was 16. A legal act had altered the shape of his life. He was no longer simply a promising aristocratic youth. He had entered the imperial succession. Names changed, titles accumulated, expectations hardened. Yet the inner movement was more complicated than any list of offices can show. The Roman world around him could measure advancement through rank, clothing, ceremony, seating, titles, and proximity to the emperor. Philosophy asked a quieter question. What does any of it do to the person inside? That question would eventually haunt Marcus's private writing. He would warn himself not to become thoroughly dyed in the imperial purple, not to become what might be called Caesarified, to allow the role of Caesar to seep so deeply into the self that the human being disappeared beneath it. But that warning belonged to the future. For the young Marcus, imperial life was now becoming daily reality. Antoninus Pius became both adoptive father and model. Marcus's later recollection of Antoninus is remarkably detailed. He admired steadiness, patience, freedom from vanity, careful attention to public business, loyalty to friends, moderation in food and comfort, and an ability to remain himself amid the machinery of power. This was philosophy without a lecture. A ruler could teach simply by being watched. Marcus saw a man occupy the highest position in the Roman state without needing to turn every moment into a display of that position. In his later recollections, he returned repeatedly to Antoninus's constancy, the ability to deliberate carefully, remain composed, and treat responsibilities as work rather than theater. Power, observed closely, became another kind of education. Marcus began assuming public duties. He served as quaestor and later as consul. He spent years beside Antoninus learning the work of government, both in Rome and within the quieter settings of imperial residences such as Lorium. Lorium lay west of Rome along the Via Aurelia. The road itself offered a gentle change of scale. The dense capital could gradually loosen into a landscape of villas, cultivated land, roads, trees, farms, and estates. The monumental weight of Rome did not disappear from Marcus's life, but beyond the city's concentrated stone there was room for another rhythm. Here, correspondence with Fronto gives glimpses of a young Caesar occupied not only by formal responsibilities, but by study and ordinary physical activity. The world of the future philosopher was still tactile. Wax tablets could receive temporary words beneath a stylus. Papyrus carried correspondence farther away. Lamps gave limited pools of light once daylight withdrew. Wool and linen touched the skin. Dust gathered along roads. Meals, exercise, reading, illness, and sleep divided days that later generations would compress into the simple phrase, the education of Marcus Aurelius. But no one lives inside a phrase. A life arrives one morning at a time, and Marcus's education was not moving in a single direction. Fronto represented the cultivated power of rhetoric. Rusticus represented suspicion toward excessive rhetorical display. Between them stood Marcus, He did not simply reject one world and enter another overnight. The correspondence with Fronto continued. Affection remained. Rhetoric had shaped him, even as philosophy increasingly taught him to distrust the desire to impress. This tension is important because Marcus's Stoicism was not born complete. The older emperor, who seemed so composed on the page, had once needed teachers to remind him where he was weak. Rusticus, Marcus later wrote, taught him not to be carried away by rhetorical composition, not to parade himself as an ascetic, not to display moral seriousness for admiration. He learned to read carefully. He learned to listen. He learned that correction did not need to be an insult. There is a profound softness hidden inside that discipline. To be corrected without resentment, to disagree without hatred, to possess authority without needing obedience in every trivial thing. These would become lifelong exercises, not achievements completed once, exercises. Perhaps that is why the private writings of Marcus can sound less like the pronouncements of a philosopher than the reminders of someone who keeps forgetting and must return. Do not be angry. Do not be distracted by fame. Remember how brief life is. Do the work in front of you. Accept what does not belong to your control. See other people as participants in the same human community. Then repeat it tomorrow, and tomorrow again. The young Marcus could not yet know how severely those exercises would be tested. For now, Antoninus Pius ruled over an empire whose Mediterranean center enjoyed relative stability. The great wars that would later draw Marcus north had not yet consumed his life. The plague that would haunt the empire had not yet arrived. Many of the people whose deaths would shape his later years were still alive. Time had not yet taken them. That may be one of the quietest ways to enter the world of Marcus Aurelius. Not through the emperor at the end of his life, but through a period when so much had not happened yet. His mother still belonged to the world he knew. Fronto's letters still traveled between teacher and pupil. Antoninus was still there to be observed. Faustina was becoming part of Marcus's future. The frontier was distant. The Danube was only a river somewhere beyond the ordinary horizon of his days, and the meditations did not yet exist. There was no book waiting on a shelf with Marcus Aurelius written upon it. There were only lessons being absorbed slowly into a human being. In the year 145, Marcus married Faustina the Younger, daughter of Antoninus Pius. Their marriage joined two lives already bound together by the imperial succession. Over the years, children would enter their household, and with them came the familiar uncertainties of family life in antiquity: pregnancy, birth, illness, survival, and loss. The imperial family could place faces on coins. It could surround births with dynastic meaning. It could give children titles and place them within plans for succession. But rank could not protect a household from mortality. Marcus and Faustina would have many children, and several would die young. The future emperor, who would write so often about impermanence, did not learn mortality as an abstract school exercise. It lived inside his family. Yet even here we must resist the temptation to invent what the surviving evidence does not give us. We do not need to place Marcus alone in a dark room or imagine words spoken beside a child's bed. The losses themselves are enough. Fronto's correspondence contains consolation and family concern. The record of births and deaths remains. The philosophical writings later reveal a man repeatedly practicing acceptance of what nature gives and takes away. There is no need to make grief louder than the evidence allows. Quiet grief is still grief. And perhaps the household taught Marcus something the palace could not. An emperor might issue an order and see it carried across provinces. A father could not command a child to remain alive. There were limits even to Caesar. Those limits would eventually become central to Marcus's understanding of the world. The body changes. People leave. Possessions pass into other hands. Names fade. Stone itself wears down. Nothing remains simply because we wish it to remain. But during these earlier years, life still moved under the long stability of Antoninus. Marcus worked beside his adoptive father and watched the routines of rule from close range. Government did not consist only of ceremonies and public appearances. It meant petitions, correspondence, legal questions, appointments, reports, decisions, consultations, and the endless arrival of matters requiring attention. The empire appeared magnificent from a distance. Up close, much of ruling it was work performed through words. A document arrives. Someone reads it. Someone waits for an answer. A decision becomes another document. A seal closes it. A courier carries it away. Somewhere far beyond Rome, the consequences begin. Marcus was being trained inside this rhythm for more than 2 decades. The philosopher and the administrator grew together. That matters, because the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius would never belong to a man who had withdrawn from society in search of perfect tranquility. He was being prepared for precisely the opposite life. People would interrupt him. Responsibilities would accumulate. His body would become tired. Other people would disappoint him. He would have to decide when information was incomplete. He would have to work with personalities he did not choose. He would lose people he loved and still be expected to continue. The philosophy forming within him was not designed to escape those conditions. It was designed to remain human inside them, and the model he kept returning to was Antoninus. Marcus remembered how his adoptive father could enjoy what was available without becoming dependent upon it. How he could work steadily without making a performance of exhaustion. How he listened to advice. How he remained accessible to friends. How he did not chase novelty simply because novelty attracted attention. The lessons sound small beside armies and monuments. That is why they mattered. A person's character is often formed in small repetitions, long before history asks anything enormous of it. Somewhere in these years, the desire for philosophical simplicity became increasingly important to Marcus. The old Roman aristocratic expectations of status remained around him. He could not simply cease being Caesar. He could not walk away from succession because a quieter life appealed to him. Instead, simplicity had to exist within responsibility. That tension would never leave. The roads between imperial residences still carried messages. The palace still required decisions. Teachers aged. Children were born. Letters arrived. Illness occasionally interrupted plans. Rome continued to wake each day beneath the same sky, its fountains running, its ovens warming, its streets filling, its temples receiving worshippers, its administrative rooms collecting the written burdens of an empire. And beyond the city, time moved almost invisibly. Hadrian had died. Antoninus had grown older. The young Caesar had become a husband, father, consul, administrator, and student of philosophy. Years passed without asking whether Marcus felt prepared for what they were carrying toward him. At Laurium, the place associated with so many quieter years of imperial life, Antoninus Pius eventually weakened. It was the year 161. For more than 2 decades, Marcus had lived beside the man who had adopted him, instructed him through example, and carried the weight that Marcus had been trained to inherit. Now that weight was beginning to move. The roads were still there. The rooms were still there. Officials still waited for decisions. Somewhere, water continued to run through Rome's fountains as it had the day before. But the long apprenticeship was drawing quietly toward its end. And the man who had spent so many years learning how not to be changed by power was approaching the moment when almost no earthly power would stand above his own. When Antoninus Pius died at Laurium in the year 161, the change that Marcus had spent most of his adult life preparing for arrived without spectacle inside the mind. There was grief first. The adoptive father he had watched for more than 2 decades was gone. The man whose patience, moderation, steadiness, and devotion to public work would later occupy such a generous place in Marcus's private recollections had reached the end that Roman law, imperial dignity, and human affection could never postpone. Then came responsibility. Messages had to move. Officials had to act. The Senate had to recognize a new ruler. The machinery of government could not linger indefinitely beside the bed of a dying emperor. Because throughout the provinces people were still appealing judgments. Soldiers were still waiting for pay. Governors were still sending dispatches. Grain was still entering ports. Taxes were still being counted, and the long roads of the empire were still carrying questions toward Rome. Marcus was almost 40 years old. For more than 20 years he had been prepared for this moment, and yet one of his first important acts was not to keep imperial authority entirely for himself. Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, was elevated beside him. For the first time, Rome formally possessed two emperors sharing the title of Augustus and the highest imperial authority. The arrangement did not make the two men identical. Marcus had spent far longer beside Antoninus Pius, learning the details of administration. Lucius had followed a different path and would later attract hostile stories from ancient writers who preferred moral contrasts. The sober philosopher and the pleasure-loving brother, discipline beside indulgence. Reality appears to have been less theatrical. The two men worked within the same imperial structure, and Marcus did not behave as though Lucius were merely decorative. He accepted him as a partner in rule. It is worth remaining for a while in the quiet strangeness of that decision. Marcus had reached the summit toward which Hadrian's succession plan had been guiding him since adolescence, and at precisely that moment he made room beside himself for someone who would repeatedly warn his own mind against vanity and the intoxication of rank. Shared power had a certain harmony with the life he had been attempting to practice. But philosophy did not make the palace simpler. If anything, the workload became more real. Rome spread below the Palatine with its layered roofs, crowded apartments, temples, workshops, markets, fountains, and streets. In the morning, the city gradually changed character as night freight traffic diminished and human voices became more prominent. Bakers had already been working. Public water moved continuously through fountains and basins. Shop fronts opened. Clients approached wealthy households. Servants crossed courtyards carrying clothing, water, documents, and food. Within the imperial residence, another kind of mourning began. Petitions waited. Letters waited. People waited. The emperor's life was surrounded by individuals whose work rarely appears in statues, secretaries, scribes, couriers, freedmen, legal advisors, guards, servants, provincial representatives, senators, and petitioners. Documents moved through their hands before reaching the emperor, and moved through those hands again after a decision had been made. A message from a distant province might begin far from Rome as the complaint of a community, an official report, a military request, or a legal uncertainty. It traveled by road or sea, entered administrative channels, was read and organized, and eventually joined the immense written conversation between the center of imperial power and the world it governed. Marcus stood at the narrowing point through which many of those questions passed. A wax tablet could hold a temporary note. Papyrus might carry formal correspondence. A reed pen touched ink. A secretary read aloud. An advisor explained. Marcus listened. And somewhere outside, a fountain continued falling into its basin. The contrast is useful. History often remembers imperial decisions by their consequences, but the physical act of governing could be very small. A hand resting near a document, a voice giving a judgment, a seal pressed into material that would secure a message before it began another long journey. Marcus's philosophical discipline had always emphasized attention to the task immediately present. Now, the present was crowded. Legal cases demanded judgment. The Senate required attention. Provincial administration continued. Grain supply mattered. Religious duties remained woven into public office. Foreign envoys could arrive carrying grievances or requests. Military reports described conditions that might be weeks old by the time they reached the palace. Information moved slowly, even when urgency moved quickly. The emperor had to decide inside that delay. There is something deeply Stoic in the ordinary reality of such work. Although Marcus did not need to turn every petition into a philosophical lesson. The world presents what it presents. The mind must meet it clearly. That simple principle became more difficult as the scale increased. Some matters concerned individuals. Others concerned cities, others concerned armies, and very soon an army would demand the attention of both emperors. To the east, Rome's relationship with the Parthian Empire entered open conflict. The trouble began early in the new reign. What had seemed distant from the marble courts and administrative rooms of Rome could not remain distant. Eastern provinces required military response, and Lucius Verus was sent toward the region while Marcus remained in Rome. So the shared emperorship took physical form. One emperor moved east. The other stayed near the center. Lucius did not conduct every operation personally in the manner of a hero from epic poetry. Experienced generals carried much of the military burden, among them Avidius Cassius, a name that would return much later in Marcus's life under very different circumstances. For now, the empire concentrated men and resources on the Eastern War. The distance between Rome and the front did not sever Marcus from events. Dispatches moved west, instructions moved east, supply, appointments, military administration, finances, diplomacy, and news traveled through the same network of roads, ships, relay stations, messengers, and written orders that bound the empire together. A victory might be old before Rome heard of it. A crisis might already have changed by the time instructions arrived. The emperor's world was therefore filled not only with power, but uncertainty. Marcus could control how carefully he read a report. He could not control how long the report had taken to reach him. He could decide what response seemed just. He could not command the roads to become shorter. The Stoic distinction between what belongs to us and what does not was no longer a schoolroom exercise. It was present in the practical limits of government. Still, Rome around him retained its ordinary life. Sunlight moved slowly across courtyards. Water touched stone. In the heat of summer, dense streets held warmth between brick and concrete walls. At night, the character of the city shifted rather than disappearing. Heavy freight wagons moved through streets from which much of that traffic had been restricted during daylight. Their wheels struck paving stones. Animals pulled loads through darkness. The vigils moved through neighborhoods, watching for fire and disorder. Oil lamps created small islands of light. A flame inside a clay lamp could illuminate the immediate world while allowing the rest of a room to remain in shadow. Wealth could buy more lamps, more servants to tend them, better rooms, thicker bedding, stronger doors. It could not turn night into day. Marcus sometimes worked into those darker hours. Documents did not cease arriving because the sun had gone down. The palace after sunset would not have become perfectly silent. Guards remained, servants moved, household life continued. Somewhere beyond the imperial complex, carts crossed Rome, taverns remained active in some districts, fountains continued running, and bakeries began the labor that would provide bread when the city woke again. For Marcus, the same day could stretch between public ceremony and private fatigue. His body was not particularly robust. The surviving traditions surrounding his health describe recurring weakness and digestive troubles, and medical care became a meaningful part of his life. Galen, one of the most remarkable physicians of antiquity, came into the imperial world during Marcus's reign and became associated with the court. Galen inhabited a universe in which medicine and philosophy still touched one another closely. The body was understood through ancient theories of balance, diet, sleep, exercise, environment, and the humors. Treatments available to Marcus belonged to that world: regulated food, baths, massage, herbal medicines, compound remedies, and careful observation. Among the medicines associated with him was theriac, a famous and complex antidotal preparation that could include opium among its ingredients. Later centuries would occasionally turn this into something more dramatic than the evidence supports. There is no need. Marcus used medicine as an ancient patient under medical supervision. The presence of opium in such preparations does not transform him into the secret addict imagined by modern sensationalism. The quieter truth is more interesting. The emperor of Rome could wake tired. His stomach could trouble him. His body could resist his intentions. He could hold immense legal authority and still depend upon sleep, food, medicine, warmth, and the judgment of physicians. The body is an efficient teacher of limits. Marcus would write repeatedly about physical discomfort and the importance of not adding unnecessary judgment to pain. The body experiences what it experiences. The mind decides whether to build another suffering around it. But such thoughts do not make exhaustion vanish. They simply change the way one meets it. Perhaps this is why the famous reminder Marcus later addressed to himself about getting out of bed feels so human. He had to remind himself that he was rising to do the work of a human being, not the work of an emperor, a human being. The distinction quietly removes the purple. It makes the morning ordinary again, outside the public responsibilities of rule. The imperial household was growing and changing. Faustina remained beside him through these years. Their family was already large, and new children continued to be born. In the same year that Marcus became emperor, Faustina gave birth to twin sons. One of them was Commodus. Nothing in the infant could yet reveal the emperor he would someday become. That knowledge belongs to hindsight. It is tempting for history to look backward from the later reign of Commodus and imagine warning signs surrounding the cradle, as though everyone in the household should somehow have understood the future. They could not. For Marcus and Faustina, he was a child born into an imperial family in a world where succession carried enormous political importance and childhood itself remained uncertain. His twin brother would not survive childhood. Other children had already died. Others would still be lost. The palace could surround a birth with ceremonial meaning and dynastic expectation, but it could not guarantee that the child would grow old. Coins might present the imperial family as an image of continuity. Nature offered no such promise. Marcus knew this personally long before he wrote so often about the flow of generations. A child's small body could become the place where all imperial power stopped. And yet life in the household continued. Another child needed attention. Another letter arrived. Another legal matter waited. The ability to continue after grief is easily mistaken for absence of grief, especially when we look at a Stoic from a great distance. But Stoicism did not require Marcus to cease caring for his children. It required him to examine what grief was doing to judgment. Affection remained. Loss remained. The question was whether sorrow would become rebellion against the nature of mortality itself. That is a more difficult philosophy than simply feeling nothing. Feeling nothing would require no discipline. To love what can be lost, while knowing that it can be lost, is another matter entirely. The Eastern War continued. Lucius Verus remained connected to Rome through the machinery of imperial communication, while Roman forces pushed successfully against Parthia. The campaign eventually brought military prestige to the shared reign. It also brought something no triumph could celebrate: disease. Soldiers returning from the East carried an epidemic into the empire. The illness we call the Antonine Plague began spreading during the middle years of the decade. Galen witnessed and described the disease. His observations included fever, severe disturbance of the body, inflammation of the throat, and characteristic eruptions of the skin. Modern scholars often consider smallpox the most likely explanation. But certainty ends there. No ancient physician could isolate a virus. No laboratory sample survives to remove every doubt. For people living through it, the name mattered less than the experience. Someone became ill, then someone else. A household changed, a barracks changed, a village changed. The quiet routines of care began. Water cloth, food left untouched, a bed that remained occupied too long, the sound of someone breathing differently, the knowledge that another person nearby had developed the same signs. An epidemic alters the emotional shape of ordinary objects. A cup becomes something handled carefully. A doorway becomes a boundary. A cough attracts attention. Distance between bodies begins to matter even before people understand why. Rome had known disease before. Ancient cities always lived close to mortality. Dense population, limited sanitation, constant movement of people and animals, and the circulation of goods across enormous distances created conditions in which illness could travel. But this epidemic was vast. It struck cities, countryside, and armies. The same network that gave Rome extraordinary reach also gave disease pathways through the empire. Roads carried soldiers. Ships carried cargo. Merchants traveled. Officials moved. Messages moved. And illness moved with human beings. A map of imperial strength could become a map of vulnerability. Marcus could issue laws and orders, but he could not command an epidemic to stop at a provincial boundary. Again, the problem of control appeared, not as philosophy written on a page. As reality, the city itself continued functioning because it had to. Fountains still ran. Bread still had to be baked. The vigils still walked at night. Markets still required goods. The dead required burial. Governments still required decisions. Armies still required men. An empire does not receive permission to become simple during catastrophe. Its existing problems remain while new ones arrive. Marcus therefore ruled through an accumulation of burdens rather than a clean sequence of separate crises. The Eastern War did not politely end before disease became important. Disease did not pause family grief. Family grief did not suspend administration. Administration did not remove his physical weakness. One experience lay upon another, and this layering may explain something essential about the voice that would later emerge in the Meditations. Marcus rarely sounds like a man waiting for life to become convenient enough to practice philosophy. There is no convenient life. There is only this one. The task in front of you. The person in front of you. The body you have. The weather that came. The letter that arrived. The loss that cannot be reversed. The mind trying to remain useful amid them. As the plague spread, the Roman military was weakened at precisely the moment when other parts of the frontier were becoming less secure. Far to the north, beyond the Mediterranean world in which Marcus had spent most of his life, the Danube ran across another landscape. There were broad river valleys there, forests, open plains, settlements, military roads, legionary forts, watch posts, and communities living close to Rome's northern limits. The climate did not resemble Rome's in every season. Winters could become severe. Rain could turn roads into mud. The river could freeze. Summer could bring heat, insects, and storms. For generations, the frontier had been maintained through forts, diplomacy, trade, military presence, and relationships with peoples beyond the imperial boundary. But movement among Germanic and Sarmatian groups was placing increasing pressure upon the region. The names would later become familiar to Marcus: Marcomanni, Quadi Aeziges. For now, reports came from far away. A disturbance at the edge of the empire could first exist for Marcus as words, a place name on a message, a number of men requested, a complaint from a commander. a question of supply. The emperor in Rome might read beneath warm Mediterranean light about a river he had not yet come to know through winter cold. Distance made everything abstract until it did not. The Parthian conflict moved toward Roman success. Lucius Verus would eventually return from the east with the honors of victory. Rome could perform the rituals expected after military achievement, presenting order restored and imperial strength affirmed. But behind the ceremonial language, the epidemic continued moving. And beyond the northern frontier, pressure continued building. The world Marcus had inherited from Antoninus Pius was changing. The long years of relative internal stability had taught him how to govern within a functioning order. Now he was beginning to learn how that same order behaved under strain. Some evenings in Rome must still have appeared almost unchanged. The sun lowered behind the city. Marble lost its harsh daylight glare. Shadows lengthened through courtyards. Servants prepared lamps. A wick caught flame. The smell of oil entered the room. Somewhere nearby, water continued its steady fall. Documents might still be stacked for attention. A courier arriving late could bring news older than the dust on his clothing. The city beyond the palace slowly rearranged itself for darkness. Shops closed while other businesses remained alive. Freight wagons began to move more freely. Dogs answered disturbances in the street. Voices traveled differently through the cooler air. And above all of it, the emperor remained one human body, sitting at the center of an enormous web of other human lives. The title Augustus could not enlarge the mind enough to contain all of them. Perhaps wisdom began partly in accepting that. Marcus did not need to know every person in the empire to believe that his duty extended toward them. Stoic cosmopolitanism had taught that rational beings belonged to a wider community, joined not merely by city or citizenship, but by their participation in the same nature. Imperial government gave that thought a difficult physical form. A petitioner from one province, a soldier in another, a farmer whose grain entered the supply system, a sick child in Rome, a senator waiting for judgment, a messenger riding north. They would never all meet, yet their lives touched through systems of obligation. Marcus's philosophy increasingly turned outward, even when it was written inward. To remind himself to be patient with difficult people was not an escape from society. It was preparation to return to society. To examine anger was preparation for dealing with another person without becoming unjust. To remember mortality was not a reason to abandon work. It was a reason not to waste the limited time available for it. This is why the image of Marcus as a philosopher, hidden away from Rome, misses something fundamental. The inward retreat existed because the outward demands were relentless. The mind needed a place to return before it could go back to work. But the northern reports were becoming harder to hold at the distance of paper. The Danube frontier was no longer merely one region among many. Pressure beyond it was increasing While plague weakened the empire's ability to respond, military manpower became more precious. Financial demands grew. The comfortable separation between the emperor in Rome and armies far away began to narrow. Marcus had spent his youth learning Greek and Latin words. He had spent his adulthood learning the habits of Antoninus. He had spent the first years of his reign reading petitions, governing beside Lucius, watching children grow and die, following a war from afar, and facing an epidemic that ignored every boundary drawn by Roman authority. Now another education was approaching. It would be taught by rivers, fortresses, wet wool, military dispatches, frozen ground, exhausted men, and roads leading north. And little by little, the distance between the Palatine and the Danube was beginning to disappear. The road north did not cross a single boundary where the familiar world suddenly ended. Rome loosened slowly. The concentrated weight of buildings gave way to roads, fields, villas, smaller settlements, cultivated ground, and the long practical landscape through which an imperial entourage had to move. Horses needed rest. Messages continued to arrive. Supplies had to follow. Guards, secretaries, officers, servants, physicians, animals, baggage, and documents traveled with a ruler whose responsibilities could not be left behind simply because the palace had disappeared from view. Marcus was not going north as an ordinary soldier. He remained emperor wherever he slept. The administration followed him. The farther the roads carried him from Rome, however, the more the physical world began to change. The northern provinces had their own rhythm. Broad valleys opened between wooded country. Rivers divided landscapes that armies needed to cross. Summer could bring dust, heat, insects, and sudden storms. Rain could turn soil beneath marching feet and wagon wheels into adhesive mud. Autumn brought cooling air and river mist. Winter transformed everything again, shortening the daylight, hardening ground with frost, and sometimes covering roads and fields with snow. The frontier did not resemble the marble image of empire. It smelled of animals, wet earth, smoke, leather, food, iron, wool, and human bodies gathered in large numbers. Roman power here was made physical: a fortress wall, a road, a ditch, a watchtower, a bridge, a granary filled before winter, a stable kept functioning through rain, a courier arriving with mud on his clothing, a sentry remaining awake while others slept. The order of Rome depended upon such ordinary things. By the later years of the decade, pressure along the Danube had grown into sustained war. Marcomanni, Quadi, and Eziges entered the increasingly familiar language of imperial reports. Movements of peoples beyond the frontier had created pressures that pushed groups toward Roman territory, and the epidemic had weakened the same military system being asked to contain them. The crisis did not remain neatly beside the river. Raids and invasions reached deeply enough to bring fear toward northern Italy itself. The frontier was no longer remote. Marcus and Lucius Verus turned their attention toward the north, and the shared reign that had begun in the administrative world of Rome became increasingly connected to armies, roads, fortresses, and the enormous practical burden of maintaining war. The change in Marcus's surroundings must have been profound, even without inventing a single private reaction. He had spent much of his life among courtyards, villas, libraries, senate meetings, teachers, family rooms, legal work, and the formal spaces of Roman government. Now military landscapes increasingly became places of government. A legionary fortress was not merely somewhere soldiers slept. It was an organized world. Roads crossed its interior. Headquarters buildings gathered administration near the center. Barracks housed men whose lives were divided by training, guard duty, maintenance, eating, sleeping, and waiting. Granaries protected food. Workshops repaired equipment. Stables contained horses and baggage animals. Bath buildings offered warmth and washing. Hospitals cared for the sick and injured. Drainage channels moved water away from places where standing mud could make daily life more difficult. Even war contained bureaucracy, perhaps especially war. A soldier needed grain before he needed glory. A horse needed fodder regardless of whether the emperor was winning. A broken strap had to be repaired. Armor had to be cleaned. Weapons needed maintenance. Bread required flour. Flour required grain. Grain required transport. Transport required animals, roads, carts, storage guards, schedules, and people who knew where everything was supposed to go. Marcus had spent years governing an empire through documents. On the frontier, those documents acquired weight. A shortage written onto a tablet meant hungry men. A delayed shipment meant empty storage. A request for replacements meant that somewhere a unit had become smaller. Numbers in a report were attached to bodies. And around the emperor, the same administrative habits continued in new surroundings. Secretaries could still prepare correspondence. Couriers still came and went. Military commanders needed audiences. Decisions had to be recorded and sent outward. Financial questions followed the campaigns. Diplomacy with peoples beyond the frontier required interpreters, envoys, hostages, negotiations, and agreements whose meaning could be measured in whether men returned home or remained under arms. An imperial headquarters therefore contained two worlds at once. The camp outside spoke in hooves, tools, commands, wagon wheels, and fire. Inside, there were voices lowered over reports, a reed pen, a wax tablet, a seal, a lamp, a map or rote remembered between officers who knew the terrain. A messenger waiting for an answer. Marcus had not escaped administration. He had carried it into a landscape where cold air could enter every time a door or heavy curtain opened. Carnuntum became one of the important centers of this frontier world. Beside the Danube, it combined military and civilian life on a scale large enough to feel like a community rather than merely a camp. The legionary fortress housed the 14th Legion Gemina. Around it stretched civilian settlement, workshops, traders, religious spaces, baths, roads. burial grounds, and the numerous lives that naturally gathered around thousands of soldiers. The Danube itself remained close. It was frontier and road at once. Water could separate Roman territory from lands beyond, yet rivers also carried goods, people, information, and military traffic. Boats and barges moved along the system. Landing places connected water to roads. Watch posts observed the opposite shore. On a calm day, the river could simply move beneath the sky. In another season, it could rise. In winter, its edges could freeze. And in severe conditions, ice could become a military fact rather than merely weather. The emperor, who had once watched water running decoratively through the ordered spaces of Roman architecture, now lived near water whose behavior could alter movement across an entire frontier. Marcus repeatedly returned in his private philosophy to images of flow. Everything passes. Time moves like a river. What has just appeared is carried away and replaced by what follows. There is no need to imagine him inventing that thought while staring at the Danube. His writings do not allow us that precision. Yet the harmony between philosophy and environment is difficult to miss. A river does not keep the same water. An army does not keep the same men. A family does not keep every child. An emperor does not keep his office forever. The human desire to hold things still meets a world that will not remain still. Perhaps this was becoming harder to ignore. The northern campaigns also brought Marcus into prolonged contact with the physical discomfort that philosophy had always asked him to regard carefully. Wet wool is heavier than dry wool. Leather stiffens differently in cold. Mud follows boots inside. Smoke from damp fuel irritates the eyes. Metal feels different when winter air has pulled heat from it. A brazier may warm the space nearest its coals, while the rest of a room remains cold. Heavy clothing helps, but it also carries moisture. Animals fill stables with warmth, breath, straw, sweat, and the sharp smell of waste. A camp after rain is not an abstract symbol of hardship. It is thousands of small inconveniences arriving at once. Water collects, ground softens, carts sink deeper, clothing takes longer to dry, fuel becomes harder to burn cleanly, feet remain wet, people become tired, orders still have to be obeyed, and for Marcus, decisions still had to be made. Stoicism could not stop rain. It offered no method for warming the Danube. Its promise was much narrower. The weather is here. What will you do with your own mind while it is here? That distinction appears again and again in Marcus's private exercises. Physical discomfort was not morally good or evil in itself. Neither was cold, sickness, reputation, wealth, or social rank. What mattered morally was the use a person made of circumstances. It is easy for such ideas to become smooth when repeated centuries later. The frontier gives them texture again. Cold is philosophically indifferent. Cold still feels cold. Pain may not damage moral character. Pain still hurts. The Stoic does not need to pretend otherwise. Marcus's discipline lay in trying not to turn physical difficulty into anger against the universe. There was enough work without adding resentment to it. At night, the fortress and camp changed character. The day's full movement diminished, though it did not vanish. Guards remained awake. Gates remained controlled. Sentries watched roads, walls, river approaches, and the darkness beyond Roman positions. Fires and lamps created scattered light inside barracks. Men slept close to the equipment and companions that formed the small military communities of their daily lives. Horses shifted in stables. A chain or harness could make a small metallic sound. Somewhere a restless animal stamped against the ground. The wind moved differently through an open military settlement than through the dense streets of Rome. There were fewer walls to break it. In winter it could pass across the frontier landscape before striking gates, roofs, tents, cloaks, and exposed skin. Smoke could hang low on calm, cold evenings. On other nights it disappeared quickly into moving air. The Danube itself offered another sound beyond the walls, sometimes gentle enough to merge with darkness, sometimes altered by wind, weather, or ice. The night watch divided time for soldiers who could not simply surrender the fortress to sleep. For them, darkness had structure. Someone was always awake. That alone changes the meaning of night. Marcus's own accommodation was not the rough sleeping place of an ordinary legionary. An emperor traveled with an imperial household and command staff, guards, administrators, servants, and the practical equipment required by rank and responsibility. At permanent bases, he could use more substantial buildings. In temporary campaign situations, his headquarters would still be distinguished from the ordinary soldier's quarters. But greater comfort did not restore the Palatine. A frontier command environment remained a frontier command environment. Dispatches could arrive at inconvenient times. Officers could require decisions. The military day did not obey the quiet rhythm of philosophical study. Perhaps this is one reason Marcus's surviving notes feel fragmented, rather than arranged like a polished book. The meditations were never prepared as a conventional work for readers. Marcus wrote them in Greek, addressing himself. They contain reminders, corrections, images, arguments, repeated exercises, and thoughts returned to from different directions. They are not a daily record. They do not tell us what happened at breakfast and what happened at sunset. They rarely explain why one particular reminder became necessary at one particular moment. That silence is important. It keeps us from turning them into fiction. But some geographical traces remain. The manuscripts associate portions of these writings with the northern campaigns, including Carnuntum and the region among the Quadi by the river traditionally identified with the Granua, the modern Hron. So there are moments when the emperor and the private philosophical voice truly do occupy the same frontier world. Not at an invented exact hour, not beside an invented exact fire, but here, among military obligations, Far from Rome, Marcus was reminding himself how to think while engaged in war. One of the most famous of those reminders begins with the difficulty of rising from bed. When reluctance comes in the morning, he tells himself to remember what he was made to do. The idea is not heroic. That is what makes it useful. He does not tell himself that emperors must rise. He tells himself that human beings have work suited to their nature. Plants carry out their nature. Animals carry out theirs. Why should a human being resist the work of being human simply because the bed is comfortable? On the frontier, the thought gains another layer without needing an invented scene. Morning might mean cold air. It might mean military reports. It might mean negotiations. It might mean illness within the camp. It might mean news from Rome. It might mean another request for money or men. Marcus did not have to enjoy rising. He had to rise. Duty in his philosophy was not a feeling. It was an action. And yet the empire's burdens continued growing. The war consumed resources. The epidemic had already weakened communities and military ranks. Recruitment became more difficult. Maintaining armies required money on a scale that could not be solved by noble thoughts. At one point the strain became visible even in Rome, where imperial possessions were sold at public auction to raise funds. Objects from the palace entered the marketplace. Art, furnishings, precious things associated with imperial wealth. There is something almost perfectly suited to Marcus's philosophy in that image, although again we need not claim that he staged it as a lesson. Objects changed hands. That was all. A thing admired inside the palace could be carried outside, given a price, purchased, and placed somewhere else. Ownership had altered. The thing remained a thing. Marcus often practiced mentally stripping luxury of the stories people placed around it. Rich foods could be understood as dead animals or plant products rather than as objects of desire. Purple cloth could be seen as wool colored with the substance used to dye it. The purpose was not discussed for its own sake. It was clarity. Do not become hypnotized by names: emperor, palace, treasure, glory, victory. Look at the material underneath. The frontier was good at removing decoration. A gold coin still had to purchase grain. A ceremonial title still had to coexist with cold feet. An emperor still needed sleep. And then another loss arrived. Lucius Verus died in the year 169 after becoming suddenly ill while traveling back from the northern region. The two emperors who had begun the reign together were no longer two. Marcus brought Lucius back into the rituals of Rome and oversaw his deification. Ancient writers would continue arguing about Lucius's character long after both men were gone. For Marcus, another person had simply passed out of the world of living obligations. His adoptive brother, his partner in imperial rule, the husband of his daughter Lucilla. Death rearranged both family and government. Marcus had already learned this lesson many times. The familiarity did not make it less real. A person can understand intellectually that everyone dies and still experience each death as a particular absence. Stoic mortality was never about pretending all losses were identical. It was about remembering that no loss violated the basic conditions of being alive. This person was mortal. So am I. So are the people I still love. Nothing about that truth becomes false because the heart resists it. Marcus would return repeatedly to earlier generations in his thoughts. Where are the famous people of the past? Where are emperors once surrounded by servants, guards, petitioners, and flatterers? Where are the people who spoke endlessly about them? Gone. And then the people who remembered them disappeared as well. Fame therefore offered poor shelter from mortality. Even memory dies eventually. The frontier made such thoughts less distant from the material world around him. Military cemeteries lined roads beyond settlements. Stone inscriptions preserved names. A soldier could have a rank, unit, birthplace, age, and years of service cut into stone. Rain still touched the inscription. Grass still grew nearby. The road remained busy. Someone passed the grave carrying tomorrow's supplies. Life and remembrance occupied the same ground without stopping for one another. Marcus's rejection of fame was not an argument that human lives were worthless. Almost the opposite. If fame cannot preserve us, then perhaps the value of action must exist before fame arrives. Justice has to matter now. Kindness has to matter now. Work has to matter while there is someone alive to benefit from it. A good act cannot depend upon applause from people not yet born. And so the emperor returned to administration, reports, audiences, negotiation, supply, military planning. The deeply unromantic work from which campaigns were made. Beyond Roman positions lived peoples whom the empire grouped under names useful for diplomacy and war. But they too were communities with families, leaders, ambitions, fears, rivalries, and pressures of their own. Marcus's philosophy taught a universal human kinship. His political role required him to conduct brutal war against human beings who crossed Roman frontiers. The tension cannot be removed by calling him a philosopher. He was not a pacifist. He commanded armies. The wars were violent. Stoicism did not prevent him from using imperial force when he believed duty required it. This too belongs inside the same man. A person may believe that human beings belong to one rational community and still participate in the violence of an ancient empire. History rarely offers us the clean consistency that later admirers prefer. Marcus had to live with that contradiction in practice, whether or not he would have described it in those terms. Perhaps his constant reminders about anger become more meaningful here. He repeatedly told himself not to hate difficult people. Human beings, he argued, were made to cooperate like parts of one body. People did wrong because they misunderstood what was truly good. Anger therefore added another error to the first. This was not an invitation to allow every action. Marcus could punish. He could command. He could resist invasion. The philosophical demand was subtler. Do what justice requires without becoming inwardly poisoned by the person who made the action necessary. That is a difficult discipline in any household. On a military frontier, it becomes severe. The temptation to turn an enemy into something less than human makes violence easier. Marcus's philosophy kept returning toward common nature, even while Roman armies crossed into hostile territory. The contradiction did not disappear, it had to be carried. As the campaigns continued, Roman forces moved beyond the Danube and into Quadi territory. The familiar fortress world gave way at times to more temporary military landscapes. Roads were less secure. Supply lines lengthened. Forests and river valleys mattered differently once the army crossed beyond the established frontier. Temporary camps reproduced Roman order wherever troops stopped defenses, controlled entrances, internal arrangements, guard duties, command areas, places for animals and equipment. For a short time, geometry was imposed upon unfamiliar ground. Then the army moved and the landscape remained. Somewhere in this broader region flowed the river the manuscripts call the Granua. The name survives because Marcus's private philosophical notes became attached to it. Among the Quadi, at the Granua, a tiny geographical trace beside thoughts addressed only to himself. The words do not tell us whether rain was falling. They do not tell us whether Marcus was warm. They do not tell us what he had eaten, which officer had visited, or whether a lamp was burning when a particular sentence was formed. But they tell us enough. The emperor who had grown up among Rome's elite households was here. The pupil of Fronto was here. The student of Rusticus was here. The adopted son of Antoninus was here. The father who had buried children was here. The co-emperor who had buried Lucius was here. The man trying to remind himself that difficult people were still human was living among an army engaged in difficult war. The place and the philosophy had finally come together. Water continued through the valley. Clouds moved. Men woke, worked, stood guard, ate, repaired equipment, carried orders, and slept. Somewhere beyond them were other men doing many of the same things under different loyalties. Marcus kept returning to the scale of the cosmos. From far enough above, borders disappear. Cities become small. Armies become smaller. A human lifetime contracts almost to nothing. Generations rise and vanish. This perspective was not meant to make duty meaningless. It was meant to make ego smaller. The emperor could be enormously important inside a Roman command tent. Under the stars, he was another temporary arrangement of matter. Soon enough, another person would bear the title. Soon enough, the body would return to nature. For now there was still work. There were campaigns yet unfinished, peoples not yet subdued, agreements not yet made, and an episode ahead that different communities would remember in entirely different ways. A sudden storm, desperate soldiers, rain falling where water had become precious, and later generations arguing over which god, which prayer, or which providence had sent it. But before those stories gathered around the event, the northern sky remained only a sky, the army remained an army, and Marcus remained a tired human being inside the duties of another frontier day. And on one of those days, the sky itself entered the memory of the war. The episode would become one of the most famous stories attached to Marcus Aurelius's northern campaigns. Roman soldiers fighting in Quadi territory found themselves in severe difficulty, exhausted and desperately short of water. Then the weather changed. Rain came. Later generations refused to leave the event alone. Roman accounts and images associated the rescue with divine intervention. Christian writers would claim that prayers offered by Christian soldiers had brought the storm. Other traditions connected it with Roman gods or with the emperor's own religious world. On the column of Marcus Aurelius, carved after his death, the event would take visible form as something greater than ordinary weather, a vast supernatural figure spreading water over the struggling Romans. The rain itself is easier to approach than the explanations. Water falling onto dry ground, water touching helmets, shields, clothing, faces, and earth, dust darkening, hard soil becoming soft, drops collecting along metal edges, men who had been thirsty receiving what moments before had seemed absent. Whatever people believed had caused it, the physical experience would have been immediate. Rain has no interest in theology. It simply falls. For Marcus, whose private reflections repeatedly returned to nature, providence, fate, and the possibility that the universe might instead be governed by atoms and material processes, the question of how events belong to the larger order of things never received a single easy answer. He often returned to a choice: either providence or atoms. Either the universe possesses an ordering intelligence, or events arise from the ceaseless movement and combination of matter. In either case, he reminded himself the ethical task remained: live well, do what belongs to you. Do not become unjust because the universe has not given you certainty. The storm passed. The campaign continued. That too is important. Events that later become monuments usually occupy only a small portion of the lives of those who experience them. After the extraordinary rain came ordinary work. Wet equipment had to dry. Animals had to be fed. Supplies had to move. Sentries still had to take their watches. Reports still had to be written. Peace still had to be negotiated or fighting resumed. The emperor who later appeared at the center of historical stories returned to decisions that left no marble image behind. The northern wars stretched across years because frontier conflict did not resolve itself through one dramatic moment. Roman armies crossed and recrossed landscapes. Agreements were made and broken. Groups submitted, resisted, moved, negotiated, and returned. Prisoners and hostages became part of diplomacy. Communities were displaced. Soldiers completed seasons of service only to face another season, and the seasons themselves kept turning. Summer heat surrendered to autumn. leaves browned and fell, rain entered roads. The first hard nights of winter made breath visible in the air. Then another spring slowly opened the country again. Marcus had always thought about change. Now the land demonstrated it constantly. A forest was green, then copper, then bare, then green again. Snow became water, mud dried into dust. A river rose and fell. A field that had held an army might later hold grass. Human beings wanted events to announce permanent meaning, but nature continued moving through them. Marcus's reflections often reduced great reputations to this scale. Alexander had died, Caesar had died, Augustus had died. Those who praised them had died. Those who hated them had died. Eventually, even many of the people who remembered their names had disappeared. An emperor could stand beneath military standards while thousands awaited his decision and still be moving toward the same silence as everyone else. The thought did not make Marcus abandon responsibility. It made responsibility more immediate. If life is short, there is less reason to postpone justice. If fame disappears, there is less reason to perform goodness for applause. If death belongs to nature, there is less reason to spend the present moment fearing a future that cannot be prevented. The northern frontier remained difficult enough without carrying imaginary burdens beside the real ones. And so Marcus returned to the mind as one returns to a shelter, not a shelter from duty, a shelter in which judgment could be cleaned before returning to duty. When another person irritated him, he reminded himself that people act according to what seems right to them, even when they are mistaken. When anger rose, he examined the anger itself. What would revenge improve? Would another person's error become less harmful if Marcus added his own? Human beings, he wrote, belonged together, like limbs of one body, like upper and lower rows of teeth, made for cooperation. The image is peaceful. The environment in which he practiced it was not. That contradiction followed him through the campaigns. There were enemies across the frontier. There were Roman dead. There were negotiations conducted after violence. There were decisions that affected thousands of lives. Marcus could believe in common humanity and still command imperial war. No gentle reconstruction should hide that. But neither should war erase everything else he was attempting to practice. A person can live inside contradiction without resolving it perfectly. Most people do. The emperor simply did so on a larger stage. Years passed. His beard grew older around a face that Roman portraiture had already made familiar across the empire. Coins carried the emperor's image into places he would never personally visit. Soldiers received pay bearing his likeness. Merchants exchanged it. Taxes returned in it. A man in a distant town could hold the emperor's face between two fingers without ever hearing his voice. Marcus understood how little that image meant in the end. He repeatedly warned himself against becoming Caesarified. The imperial purple could dye more than cloth. A title repeated often enough could enter the mind. People bowed. People waited. People praised. People learned to agree quickly. The danger was not only cruelty. It was forgetting that the emperor remained a man. Marcus looked toward Antoninus Pius whenever he needed another example. His adoptive father had been powerful without continually displaying power, steady, accessible, patient with advisors, moderate in comfort, unimpressed by unnecessary luxury. The memory remained useful because Antoninus himself was gone. A dead man could still teach through the habits another person remembered. Marcus had begun his private writings by gathering such debts: grandfather, mother, teachers, friends. Antoninus, a life built from other lives. Perhaps the self was never as solitary as it felt. Every good habit contained someone else's example. Every sentence carried words learned from another voice. Every judgment had been shaped by correction. Marcus, ruler of an empire, remained in this sense a collection of gifts received from people who were disappearing one by one. Then, in the year 175, the distance between life and rumor almost overturned the empire. Avidius Cassius, the experienced commander who had once served Rome successfully in the Eastern Wars, was now one of the most powerful men in the eastern provinces. News spread that Marcus Aurelius had died. The report was false. But before the truth could move across the same immense distances that had carried the rumor, Cassius was proclaimed emperor. For Marcus, this was not merely a frontier rebellion beyond his attention. A rival now claimed imperial authority. Another Roman army might soon face his own. The old problem of delayed information returned with far greater consequences. A message leaves one city. Days pass. Another message follows. Somewhere between them, people act upon what they believed to be true. An empire tied together by roads and couriers could still be divided by the time required for truth to travel. Marcus prepared to go east. His philosophical writings had asked repeatedly how one should respond to people who caused harm. Now the question had a name: Avidius Cassius. Ancient accounts preserve Marcus as favoring clemency rather than revenge toward those involved. Before the two sides could meet in battle, however, Cassius was killed by his own officers. The rebellion ended almost as quickly as it had appeared. Marcus did not receive the confrontation history might have expected. There was no grand duel of rival emperors. Instead, there were consequences: families, officials, senators, cities that had chosen sides, men who now feared punishment. The temptation toward retaliation would have been entirely conventional in Roman political life. Civil conflict had taught generations that defeated rivals could bring executions, confiscations, exile, and the destruction of families. Marcus chose a gentler path toward many of those involved. Clemency was not simply softness. For an emperor, it was a political act. But it also belonged naturally beside the philosophical discipline he had been practicing for years. Do not hate the person who has acted wrongly. Correct where correction is required. Protect the community. but do not become the thing you condemn. The empire did not need another battlefield merely because anger desired one. So Marcus continued eastward even after Cassius was dead. The journey now had another purpose. The provinces that had recently accepted a rival emperor needed to see the surviving emperor. Presence mattered in Roman politics. A portrait on a coin was useful. A decree was useful. But a ruler physically entering a city could restore relationships in a way that parchment could not. Roads opened ahead. The landscape changed again. The forests and cold rivers of the north gave way eventually to eastern provinces with different light, vegetation, architecture, languages, foods, temples, and memories. Marcus had governed these places for years through correspondence. Now he moved among them. There is a quiet difference between reading the name of a province and feeling its climate. Paper makes geography flat. Travel restores distance. Every mile requires time. Every city has its own smell. Every road passes through local lives that continue regardless of imperial crisis. Farmers still watched crops. Shopkeepers still opened doors. Children still played. Temples still received offerings. Travelers still searched for shade and water. An emperor might enter with guards and officials, yet the world around him remained full of people whose concerns were much smaller and often more immediate than succession. Food, health, debt, weather, family. Marcus's philosophy had always insisted that imperial status did not make him a different species of being. Travel made that easy to see. Everywhere, human life repeated itself in altered forms. People loved. People feared. People buried parents. People worried over children. People grew angry. People became tired. People wanted recognition. People died. The Stoic idea of a common human community no longer needed to remain an abstraction formed in Greek texts. The empire itself offered endless variations of the same fragile creature. And beside Marcus, on this eastern movement, was Faustina. She had lived through decades of marriage with him, through children born and children buried, through the transformation of her husband from heir to emperor, through plague, war, travel, and political uncertainty. Ancient gossip would later surround her name with stories of infidelity and intrigue. The most hostile of those stories come from sources that deserve caution. Marcus's own surviving gratitude presents something different. He remembered a wife he regarded as affectionate and unpretentious. During the military years, she received the title Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camp. Whatever ceremonial and political purposes the title also served, it connected her public image to the army and frontier world through which the imperial household had moved. Now, during the Eastern journey, Faustina died at Halala in Cappadocia. Another absence opened. There is little value in inventing the room. We do not know the exact words Marcus spoke. We do not need to imagine whether he sat beside a lamp or looked toward some distant mountain. The evidence gives us enough. His wife of roughly 3 decades was gone. the mother of his children, the daughter of the man who had been his adoptive father, one of the last living bridges back to the long peaceful years before Marcus had become emperor. The Senate deified her. Her image entered commemorative coinage. Honors preserved her position publicly. But deification did not restore a conversation. A statue cannot answer. A coin does not breathe. Marcus had spent years reminding himself that every human being must return to nature. Now the reminder had another face. Stoicism is sometimes misunderstood here. Acceptance is not a claim that loss is pleasant. It is not a command to feel nothing. It asks instead whether grief will demand an impossible universe. A universe in which the people we love do not die. A universe in which bodies do not change. A universe in which nothing is taken from us. No such world had ever existed. Marcus's discipline was to love within the world that did. The world where Faustina could share decades of life with him and still leave first. The world where children could be born into imperial palaces and still die before their parents. The world where Antoninus could teach him how to rule and then disappear before seeing what the reign became. Everything given was temporary. Temporary did not mean meaningless. Perhaps it meant the opposite. A moment mattered because it could not be possessed forever. After Faustina's death, the Eastern journey continued. The emperor's work did not end with private loss. This pattern had repeated throughout Marcus's life. The empire did not arrange itself around grief. A courier could arrive while someone mourned. A legal question could remain unresolved because death had entered a household. People still waited. Marcus continued through eastern cities, carrying both public authority and private absence. Eventually the journey brought him toward Athens. For a man whose inner life had been shaped so profoundly by Greek philosophy, the city possessed a different kind of importance. Long before Marcus was born, Stoicism had begun there. Zeno had taught in the painted porch from which the school took its name. Other philosophical traditions had also taken root in the city's streets, gymnasia, gardens, and schools. Generations of students had come to Athens to listen, argue, memorize, question, and learn. Marcus arrived not as a young student, but as the emperor of Rome. Yet philosophy remained one of the languages through which he understood himself. In Athens, he supported established philosophical teaching, endowing chairs associated with the major schools. The act suited the man who had spent his life acknowledging teachers. Knowledge did not appear from nowhere. It required people. A teacher needed time. Students needed places to gather. Texts needed copying. Tradition survived because one generation handed something to another. Marcus had received Epictetus through Rusticus. He had received rhetoric through Fronto. He had received practical examples through Antoninus. Now imperial resources could help other teachers continue the chain. Athens also brought Marcus into the Eleusinian mysteries. The rites themselves were ancient and secretive, centered on traditions connected with Demeter and Persephone, and with ideas of loss, return, and the human relationship with death. Marcus was initiated. The details of what initiates saw and experienced were guarded carefully in antiquity, and there is no reason to fill the silence with invention. The secrecy itself is enough. An emperor accustomed to receiving reports from across the known world entered a ritual whose meaning could not simply be reduced to an administrative document. Some things were experienced rather than explained. Some things remained unseen by outsiders. The philosophical emperor lived in a world where reason and traditional religion did not occupy entirely separate rooms. He performed Roman religious duties. He respected ancestral cult. He thought about providence. He wondered about atoms. He participated in mystery rites. Ancient life could contain all of these without demanding the modern boundaries we might place between them. And perhaps Athens offered Marcus another view of time. The city had already been old when Rome was young. Men whose ideas Marcus still read had walked there centuries earlier. Their bodies were gone. Their words remained. For someone who repeatedly dismissed personal fame as fragile, this survival of philosophy was different from ordinary reputation. The important thing was not that Zeno's name endured. It was that an idea could still help another human being. Marcus did not need people in a distant future to admire Marcus Aurelius. If something true could pass through him and remain useful, that was enough. The distinction is quiet. Fame asks to be remembered. Philosophy asks to be practiced. Athens had remembered many names. Time had erased many more. Columns weathered, stone chipped, buildings changed uses. Voices vanished. But students still sat with teachers. Questions still passed between generations. Marcus's own notebooks were not written for such survival. He did not prepare the Meditations as a public book. He addressed himself. That makes their eventual endurance strangely appropriate. The man who warned himself not to care about posthumous reputation would become famous partly because private words survived without his planning it. But that future did not yet exist for him. He still had imperial work ahead. From the eastern journey, Marcus eventually returned toward Rome. The capital received him not simply as the philosopher who had wandered through Athens, but as the emperor who had survived rebellion, war, epidemic, and another family death. A triumph followed his return, shared with Commodus. The son who had once been only an infant in the imperial household was now entering public power more visibly. Marcus's decision to elevate Commodus would later become one of the most criticized choices of his reign. The later emperor would leave behind a reputation so dark that generations looked backward and asked how Marcus could have allowed him to inherit. But hindsight is a cruel form of prophecy. Marcus did not possess the future. He knew Commodus as his living son within Roman dynastic politics, not as the completed figure later historians would condemn. The adoption system that had produced Marcus himself had not been a philosophical examination in which Rome simply selected the wisest available man. It had been shaped by circumstance, family, mortality, and political necessity. Marcus now had a biological son surviving toward adulthood. Dynastic continuity had its own logic. Commodus was gradually raised into imperial status, and in the year 177 he became Augustus beside his father. Once again there were two emperors, but nothing had returned to the beginning. Lucius Verus was gone. Antoninus was gone. Faustina was gone. Many children were gone. Marcus himself was older, physically worn, and shaped by years far removed from the relatively peaceful apprenticeship of his youth. Rome around him had changed too. The epidemic had passed through households. Wars had altered finances. The northern frontier remained unsettled. Triumph could cover the streets with ceremony, but ceremony could not change geography. Beyond the Alps and farther along the Danube, the unfinished problems were still waiting. Inside Rome, ordinary life continued with its familiar stubbornness. Night carts rattled over paving. Bakers worked before dawn. Fountains flowed. Servants tended lamps. Clients approached great houses. Children grew. The city absorbed emperors and funerals alike. Marcus could return to the Palatine, but the palace no longer represented the secure center it once had. Perhaps no place did. The idea of an inner citadel becomes easier to understand after so much movement. A person cannot make Rome permanent, cannot make a military camp permanent, cannot make a marriage permanent, cannot make health permanent, cannot make political loyalty permanent. So Marcus kept searching for a form of steadiness that did not require the external world to stop changing. The governing mind, the capacity to choose one's response, the ability to remain just when insulted, to remain useful when tired, to remain mild when anger appears, to remember that praise and blame both pass quickly, to do what is required without demanding that the universe reward the effort. That was the shelter he carried, not invulnerability. Practice, and practice was necessary because Marcus was not finished. The northern frontier had not settled into lasting peace. The same rivers still marked the imperial edge. The same roads still carried military supplies. The same fortresses still watched lands beyond them. Men who had already spent years campaigning would be asked for more. Marcus had returned from the east, passed again through Rome, placed greater authority beside his son, and watched another brief interval of imperial ceremony fade into ordinary days. Then the roads began drawing him north once more. The marble courts would recede again. The air would grow colder. Military reports would become landscapes. The Danube would return, and somewhere beyond the last comfortable rooms of Italy, another stretch of Marcus Aurelius's life was waiting beneath the northern sky. The journey north had become familiar by then, not easy, not ordinary, but familiar. Marcus had traveled enough roads to know how the landscape changed as Rome fell behind. The great city slowly released its hold. Dense streets opened into countryside. Villas gave way to cultivated fields, then to longer stretches of road between towns, posting stations, river crossings, and military routes. The imperial entourage moved with its own rhythm, carrying not only baggage, but government itself, guards, secretaries, officials, physicians, servants, couriers, animals, documents, and all the small practical objects required for a ruler to continue ruling far from the palace. Commodus now shared the imperial title with his father. He was still young. Later generations would look back at the name Commodus and see everything that followed. They would remember the emperor he became, his obsession with spectacle, the violence and instability of his reign, and the abrupt contrast between his rule and that of Marcus. But none of that had happened yet. Marcus could not remember the future. He could only act within the present, and in that present, Commodus was his surviving son and co-emperor, part of a dynastic arrangement intended to preserve continuity in a political world where uncertain succession had often produced civil war. The road did not reveal whether the choice would prove wise. It simply continued north. By the later years of Marcus's reign, the Danube had become almost another center of imperial life. Rome remained the capital. The Senate remained there. The temples, archives, courts, palaces, and great public spaces remained. But the emperor increasingly lived where military necessity required him. The frontier received him again with its colder air, fortified roads, river landscapes, and the disciplined repetition of camp life. Nothing about a Roman army at rest was truly still. Men repaired what marching damaged. Leather had to be softened and maintained. Metal required cleaning. Clothing needed drying. Food had to be measured and prepared. Animals needed water, fodder, grooming, and shelter. Guards changed watches. Messages arrived. Reports left. A camp or fortress breathed through routine. Even in darkness, someone was working. Perhaps a sentry watched a gate while frost whitened the ground nearby. Perhaps somewhere inside a barracks, a man shifted beneath a wool blanket while another prepared to replace him at the wall. Perhaps a horse stirred against straw. The exact moments are lost, but the structure of such nights remains recoverable. Roman military discipline divided darkness into responsibilities. Someone always stayed awake so others could sleep. For Marcus, the night carried its own duties. The emperor's headquarters could become quieter, but never entirely private. The world could enter through a messenger. A sealed dispatch might arrive from another base. An officer might need a decision before dawn. A local negotiation might have altered. A supply problem could require attention. The lamps might burn longer than anyone wished. And somewhere beneath those responsibilities lived the body of a man approaching 60. Marcus had never possessed effortless health. Years of administrative work, travel, illness, family loss, and campaigning had left their marks. The beard seen in his later portraits belonged now to an older face. Time, which Marcus had examined so often in thought, had been working on him while he wrote about it. There is a quiet irony in trying to understand impermanence while one's own body demonstrates it. A young man can think about aging. An older man feels it when standing. He feels it after travel. He feels it when cold enters tired muscles. He feels it when an illness lasts longer than it once did. The body becomes less willing to pretend that time is theoretical. Marcus did not need philosophy to tell him he was mortal anymore. The evidence was with him each morning. Yet his writings never turn mortality into theatrical despair. Death appears again and again, but often as something almost ordinary. A natural event, a transformation, a return. He reminds himself that the elements of the body will separate and enter other forms. What has been assembled will be disassembled. What has come from nature will go back into nature. The language can sound severe if read quickly, but there is gentleness hidden in it. Nothing is being singled out for punishment. The leaf falls because leaves fall. The fruit ripens and passes. Generations enter the world and leave it. The same nature that produces a child also produces an old man. Marcus did not ask for an exception. He had spent too much of his life watching exceptions fail. Antoninus Pius had been emperor. He died. Lucius Verus had been emperor. He died. Faustina had been Augusta. She died. Children born into the safest household Rome could provide had died. Soldiers died. Enemies died. Famous men from centuries before had become names. Others had lost even their names. The title Caesar did not create another category of mortality. It only made the funeral more public. Outside Marcus's quarters, the war continued. The later northern campaigns again placed Roman forces against communities beyond the frontier. The Marcomanni, Quadi, Aziges, and other peoples of the region had not disappeared because treaties had been signed earlier. The frontier remained a shifting political environment in which pressure, negotiation, movement, and violence returned in different combinations. Marcus continued campaigning. The philosopher emperor had become an old military ruler, almost despite the peaceful image that later centuries preferred. He was not a man who simply wrote about tranquility beneath a tree. He spent much of his later reign directing war. The contrast matters. Peace was valuable precisely because he had seen what its absence required. The calm voice of the Meditations did not come from a calm life. It came from someone repeatedly trying to create order within himself, while the exterior world refused to cooperate. Perhaps that is why the same ideas return so often. Marcus had to repeat them because understanding something once was not enough. Do not surrender your mind to anger again. Do not chase praise again. Remember that this will pass again. Do the work before you again. Human beings are made for cooperation again. Death is natural again. A philosophy repeated privately is not necessarily a philosophy mastered. It may be the opposite. The places where Marcus repeats himself may be the places where he struggled most, and one struggle appears with remarkable persistence. Other people, the difficult person, the arrogant person, the ungrateful person, the selfish person, the dishonest person. Marcus begins one famous reflection by preparing himself to meet exactly such people, not because the world had suddenly become unusually unpleasant, because this was normal human society. He reminds himself that those who behave badly do so because they misunderstand good and evil. He reminds himself that he shares a common nature with them. He reminds himself that anger cannot change that kinship. For an emperor, the exercise was especially important. Most people can become angry and damage a room. An emperor could become angry and damage a family, a city, or a province. Power amplifies the consequences of an undisciplined emotion. Perhaps this is one reason Marcus feared the moral effect of becoming Caesarified. The palace could teach a ruler that irritation deserved punishment, that disagreement was disloyalty, that criticism was insult, that inconvenience was injustice. Marcus spent years reminding himself not to believe those things. The frontier offered fewer flatteries than Rome. Weather does not care that a man is emperor. Mud does not move aside. A fever does not bow. Wind does not lower its voice. Nature behaves with a kind of perfect political indifference. It treats Caesar and soldier according to the same physical laws. A wool cloak becomes wet on either shoulder. Cold air enters either pair of lungs. Perhaps that equality was useful. When Marcus looked upward, the stars offered an even greater reduction of rank. He often asked himself to imagine the world from above. Cities, fields, seas, people marrying, people dying, armies, markets, ships, courts, everywhere the same movement of human activity. From high enough, the emperor's tent becomes difficult to distinguish from everything else. The entire frontier becomes a narrow line. Rome becomes a small patch of earth. The Mediterranean itself becomes contained. And above it all, the universe continues without recognizing the borders humans have drawn below. This view from above was not an invitation to abandon earthly duty. Marcus returned from the cosmic scale precisely so he could work without imagining his ego to be cosmic. Be small, then do the small task well. Listen carefully, judge fairly, answer the letter, endure the weather, control the anger, help where help is possible. There was no need to save eternity. Eternity was not asking. Another winter passed across the northern world. Snow could soften the hard geometry of fortifications, covering roof edges, roads, ditches, fields, and the uneven ground beyond walls. Then thaw would undo the whiteness. Water entered soil, roads softened, wheels cut deeper, boots collected mud. Spring never arrived as a philosophical symbol for soldiers. It arrived as altered logistics. But nature continued offering Marcus the same lesson without speaking. Form changes. Nothing holds. The snow you saw is water. The water will move. The body you know is matter arranged temporarily. The arrangement will change. Even Rome. Marcus sometimes thought about cities destroyed long ago. Places once filled with life become ruins. People who believed their problems enormous disappear. The palace that seems permanent is only stone waiting for time. He could remember emperors whose names once whole rooms to become silent. Where were they now? Some survived as statues, some as histories, some as warnings, some only as fragments. Fame therefore became almost comic when measured against enough time. Marcus imagined people desperate to be remembered by future generations who themselves would soon die. One temporary person begging another temporary person not to forget him. Yet there was no bitterness in the conclusion, only release. If reputation is so unstable, then it can stop controlling you. You can act because the act is right, not because someone might carve it into stone. This freedom would become important in the way later generations misunderstood Marcus himself. They turned him into an image, the philosopher king, the last good emperor, the wise old ruler standing between Rome and decline. These labels came afterward. Marcus himself would likely have recognized the danger in all of them. A title can hide the person beneath. Even admiration can distort. He was not wisdom carved in marble. He became impatient. He became tired. He needed reminders. He participated in war. He made political choices that later ages would criticize. He could not see Commodus's future. He could not solve every crisis. He could not make plague disappear. He could not prevent every death. He was a man practicing. That may be the most useful way to leave him. Not perfected, practicing. By the year 180, the northern campaigns were still active. Marcus was still away from the peaceful domestic world of his youth. His final illness came on the frontier. The exact location of his death remains uncertain in the surviving tradition, associated either with Sirmium or Vindobona. The uncertainty feels almost appropriate. History sometimes wants an exact room, an exact bed, an exact final sentence. The evidence gives less, so we should allow it to remain less. We know the season, we know the year. We know that Marcus Aurelius, emperor for nearly 2 decades, became gravely ill while the northern military situation still occupied Rome's attention. We know that his body was failing, and we know that the philosophy he had spent years practicing had been preparing him for precisely this event. Not this date, not this place, death itself. Marcus had told himself not to behave as though a human life were something owed indefinitely. He had watched enough departures to understand the pattern. His own turn did not create a new rule. There is something peaceful in imagining no final revelation, no sudden discovery, no secret wisdom arriving at the last moment. What would the last moment teach that life had not already taught? Bodies are temporary. People must leave one another. The present is all we can actually use. Character belongs more securely to us than reputation. Anger wastes what little time we have. The work of a human being is to live among other human beings. Nature changes everything. Marcus had been writing variations of these truths for years. Death did not need to explain them again. On the 17th day of March, in the year 180, Marcus Aurelius died. He was 58 years old. The empire remained. For a moment, perhaps that is the strangest part. The world did not stop. Somewhere in the military settlement, a guard remained on duty. Animals still required feeding. Water still moved along channels. Smoke still rose from fires. The Danube continued flowing. A courier still had somewhere to go. Someone somewhere was baking bread. Someone else was waking a child. A merchant counted coins, carrying the face of a man who was no longer alive. The ordinary world absorbed the death of an emperor without losing its rhythm. Commodus now stood as sole ruler. The succession Marcus had prepared became reality. There was no return to the adoption sequence that had brought Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus into later narratives of ideal emperorship. The biological son inherited. What Commodus would do with that inheritance belongs to another world. Marcus could no longer guide it. That too was part of letting go. Parents prepare children and then lose control of what the children become. Teachers instruct students and cannot govern every future choice. Emperors establish institutions and cannot command the next reign. Every life eventually reaches a boundary beyond which responsibility must pass to other hands. Marcus's body was returned to Rome. There, the rituals of imperial death transformed the private fact of mortality into public memory. The Senate deified him. His remains were placed in Hadrian's mausoleum, the immense tomb beside the Tiber that had already received members of the imperial house. The structure had been built to resist time. Stone and concrete could last longer than flesh, but Marcus's philosophy would have recognized the difference between longer and forever. Even monuments change. Cities build around them. Names shift. Surfaces weather. Empires vanish. The mausoleum itself would survive into worlds Marcus could not have imagined, altered and repurposed by generations that no longer lived within the Roman religious universe in which it had been constructed. Nothing escapes transformation, not even the places we build for the dead. Elsewhere in Rome, another monument would preserve the northern wars. The column of Marcus Aurelius would wrap military scenes upward around stone, freezing moments of campaigning into carved bodies, soldiers, rivers, fortifications, enemies, marches, violence, the famous rain. A war that had once been mud, cold, fear, hunger, fatigue, command, and waiting became relief sculpture. Life became image. The emperor became memory. And the private notes Marcus had never prepared for publication somehow survived too. This may be the quietest accident of all. The meditations were not written to build a reputation. They were written inward. Reminders from Marcus to Marcus. words meant to correct one temporary human mind. Yet centuries carried them farther than imperial proclamations. People who would never care about the details of Roman administration would read the frustrations of a tired emperor, telling himself to get out of bed. People living in cities Marcus never knew would recognize his irritation with difficult people. People mourning losses in languages that did not yet exist in his world would find him reminding himself that change belongs to nature. The private became universal, not because Marcus tried to sound universal, but because the problems were ordinary. We wake reluctantly. We become angry. We want approval. We fear losing people. We want circumstances to obey us. We confuse temporary things with permanent ones. We waste the present while imagining some better future moment. An emperor discovers that the same mind lives beneath the purple. Perhaps this is where human and time can leave him. Not in the Senate, not beneath a triumphal arch, not even beside his deathbed. We can return instead to the frontier. The camp continues after Marcus is gone. A late winter wind moves across open ground. A sentry adjusts the wool around his shoulders. The river passes somewhere in the darkness. Inside a room or military building, a lamp burns beside administrative work that now belongs to someone else. The flame does not know whose reign it is. A sheet of papyrus waits. A stylus rests near wax. Footsteps approach and fade. Farther away, a horse shifts. Smoke catches briefly in cold air and disappears. Beyond the Roman position, forests stand beneath the same sky. People whom Rome called enemies prepare food, tend animals, speak with their families, and sleep beneath the same stars. The border remains important to governments. The stars do not see it. Above them, the constellations, Marcus knew, continue their slow movement. He had looked at the same sky and reminded himself how small human affairs become when placed beside the universe. Now he has entered that scale himself. His arguments are finished. His petitions are finished. The messages bearing his orders no longer leave the headquarters. No one needs to wake him. And still the world is not empty. That is the peace inside his philosophy. Death does not require the universe to become silent. Quite the opposite. Others continue. The river remains. Children are born. Trees leaf again. Soldiers return home or remain on duty. Teachers open texts. Students listen. Another emperor's face appears on coins. Another generation believes its worries have never existed before. Time carries them gently forward. Perhaps somewhere in Rome, water falls from a fountain into stone as it did when Marcus was a child. The sound has no memory of the boy who once lived nearby. And perhaps that does not diminish the life at all. Marcus himself spent years trying to release the need to be remembered. A good life did not need eternity as a witness. It needed only the moment in which goodness was possible. The hand that could help now. The anger that could be released now. The duty that could be performed now. The person who could be treated justly now. Everything else belonged to time. so the roads remain beneath the fading light. Rome remains far to the south. The Danube continues toward distant waters. Somewhere a lamp is extinguished because it is no longer needed. Darkness settles softly over the frontier without becoming empty. There are still guards awake, still animals breathing, still water moving beneath the night, still wind passing through grass and bare branches. The world Marcus Aurelius tried so carefully to understand has not stopped for him. It simply continues doing what he spent a lifetime teaching himself to accept: changing, flowing, arriving, passing away, and becoming, quietly, something else.